Welcome back. Tonight, I want to tell you about a trial that takes place inside you, quietly, every single day of your life. One you've likely never noticed is even happening, let alone recognized as a trial with real, lasting consequences hanging on the verdict. There's no courtroom involved, no judge in a robe, no dramatic gavel strike echoing through a chamber. But there is a crowd, a genuine choice, and a prisoner released back into your life each and every time you make it. And the specific prisoner you release day after day without ever noticing has been quietly, steadily shaping everything about the life you're currently living, whether you've been aware of the pattern or not. Neville Goddard once took one of the strangest, most overlooked moments in the entire gospel narrative, the crowd's choice between two prisoners standing side by side, only one of whom would walk free that day, and showed that it wasn't simply an ancient historical account, dusty and distant from anything relevant to modern life. It was a description of something happening inside every single person, every single day, whether they've ever read a page of scripture in their life or not. Two names, two options, one crowd standing in for something considerably closer to home than we'd initially assume when we first hear the story told. Tonight, we're going to walk through this slowly and completely because it genuinely rewards patience far more than it rewards a quick surface level summary. What the two names in this story actually mean beneath their surface, why Neville insisted this wasn't ancient history at all, but a live event happening inside you right now, in this very room, as you listen. What it actually means, in practical and specific terms, to choose one over the other, rather than in abstract theological language that stays comfortably distant from your actual Tuesday afternoon. Why so many sincere people genuinely wanting one outcome keep unknowingly choosing the other one instead. And how to recognize in your own ordinary day exactly which one you're currently releasing, because the choice, Neville taught, is never made once and settled. It's made constantly in small, unremarkable moments you've probably never thought to examine closely before tonight. This is a long one. Get settled and let's begin properly. Two names, two meanings. To understand this teaching properly and completely, it helps enormously to know what the two names in the story actually mean at their root, because Neville built his entire interpretation directly on their literal meaning rather than treating them simply as arbitrary historical figures whose names happen to survive in the record. The first name, in its original language, essentially translates to something like Son of the Father, an ordinary generic designation, the kind of name that could plausibly describe nearly anyone at all, not a title of any particular distinction, not a claim to anything special or set apart, simply an unremarkable descendant, one among countless others throughout history, defined entirely by ordinary lineage and current condition, and nothing more substantial than that. The second name carries a considerably different, weightier meaning, something closer to deliverer or savior, a name that points directly and unmistakably toward rescue, toward a genuine power capable of changing an otherwise fixed, settled outcome into something else entirely. In the story itself, a crowd is offered a choice between these two very different figures. One prisoner represents ordinary, unremarkable humanity as it currently stands, bound tightly by circumstance, defined entirely by lineage and present condition, offering no real transformation, no genuine deliverance from anything difficult. The other represents something like the exact opposite of that, a living, active claim to authority over circumstance itself, a genuine power capable of overturning what currently seems fixed, permanent, and settled beyond question. The crowd, given this specific choice, chooses the ordinary prisoner. They release the one who offers nothing beyond what they already visibly have in front of them, and they turn away deliberately from the one who represents genuine deliverance from their current condition. Neville's entire teaching, built on this passage, rests on a single, genuinely unsettling observation. This isn't simply something that happened once to one particular crowd on one particular afternoon buried in ancient history. It's a choice being made constantly inside every single person alive, whenever they're asked, implicitly and usually without noticing, which authority they're actually going to trust in that moment. The trial that happens every day. Here is the actual central claim worth genuinely sitting with tonight, because it's considerably more demanding in practice than a simple historical retelling would ever be. Neville taught that this exact trial, this precise choice between an unremarkable, circumstance bound identity and a genuinely creative, delivering power residing within you, takes place inside you constantly, not as a single dramatic event experienced once, but as an ongoing, largely unnoticed pattern running quietly underneath your entire ordinary day, every day, whether you've ever consciously acknowledged it or not. Every single time something difficult happens to you, a setback, a disappointment, an unwanted piece of news arriving unexpectedly, you're handed in that precise moment an implicit choice, whether or not you ever consciously notice it as one at all. You can release the ordinary prisoner, accept the circumstance as the final governing authority over your entire life going forward, letting your current bank balance, or your present situation, or the plain report of your senses render the complete verdict on what remains possible for you from here. Or, alternatively, you can release the other prisoner instead, assert quietly and deliberately that circumstance is not actually the final authority in the matter, that something genuine within you carries real power to author what comes next, entirely regardless of what the current visible evidence seems to suggest at this moment. Most people, most of the time, without any dramatic or conscious decision making process involved at all, release the ordinary prisoner by default. It doesn't feel in the moment like a genuine choice being made. It feels instead like simple realism, like plainly accepting the facts exactly as they currently, visibly are. But Neville's entire point, repeated across many lectures in many forms, was that this apparent realism is itself a genuine choice, made so habitually and so invisibly over years of repetition that it no longer registers consciously as a decision at all. It's simply what most people do by unquestioned default, in much the same way a person might default automatically to their native language without ever consciously choosing in any given moment to speak it that particular day. This is precisely why the trial happens daily, repeatedly, rather than occurring once and then being permanently settled for good. It isn't a single verdict handed down and then fixed in place forever afterward. It's a continuous pattern of small, repeated choices made in ordinary, unremarkable moments scattered throughout an entirely ordinary day, each one either reinforcing the authority of external circumstance a little further, or reinforcing instead the authority of something considerably deeper residing within you. What it actually means to choose the ordinary prisoner. It's genuinely worth being concrete here about what choosing the ordinary prisoner actually looks like in real daily life, because it rarely announces itself with any obvious drama or fanfare. It shows up instead in small, easily overlooked moments that most people never think to pause and examine closely, moments that pass by so quickly they barely register as choices at all. It looks like receiving disappointing news of some kind and immediately, almost automatically, treating it as a settled, permanent fact about your entire future, rather than treating it as one isolated piece of information about a single passing moment in time. It looks like checking a bank balance on your phone and letting that single number alone determine your entire sense of what's genuinely possible for you this month, this year, or across your whole remaining life. It looks like recalling some past failure from years ago and quietly letting it redefine what you're currently capable of today, as though the past somehow holds permanent, binding authority over the present simply by virtue of having happened first, earlier in the timeline. None of this typically feels, in the actual moment it's happening, like a dramatic act of capitulation or surrender. It feels instead like plain, ordinary honesty, like refusing to indulge in unrealistic, foolish thinking, like being a responsible, clear eyed adult who deals sensibly with hard facts rather than comforting fantasies. This is precisely what makes the choice so remarkably easy to make repeatedly, day after day, without ever once noticing you're actively making it at all. Releasing the ordinary prisoner doesn't feel from the inside like giving something valuable up. It feels instead like simply being sensible and grounded. But Neville's teaching asks something genuinely uncomfortable of us here, something worth sitting with rather than deflecting. What if that entirely sensible feeling posture is itself the exact daily choice being described symbolically in this ancient story? What if what feels from the inside like simple, honest realism is actually the crowd shouting, quietly and habitually, for the release of the very prisoner who offers nothing whatsoever beyond what already visibly exists in front of them? What it actually means to choose the deliverer. Choosing the other prisoner instead looks considerably different in practice, and it's genuinely worth being equally concrete and specific about this side of the choice, because it's remarkably easy to leave this half of the teaching vague and merely inspirational, rather than specific and genuinely usable in an ordinary Tuesday. It looks like receiving that exact same disappointing news and consciously, deliberately declining to treat it as final and settled, not through outright denial of the underlying facts involved, but through a genuine, deliberate refusal to let those facts alone author everything that comes afterward. It looks like checking that same bank balance, seeing that identical number staring back at you, and choosing nonetheless to hold, alongside that entirely honest observation, a settled inner assumption that current circumstances are not actually the fixed, permanent ceiling they appear to be at first glance. It looks like recalling that same past failure from years ago and consciously, deliberately refusing to let it define today's genuine capability, treating it instead as a single isolated data point drawn from a considerably different state you no longer actually occupy. This isn't pretending in any sense that the difficult circumstance simply doesn't exist or didn't happen. It's a considerably more precise, more disciplined act than simple denial ever could be, fully acknowledging what's currently honestly true while simultaneously declining to grant it final, governing authority over everything that remains genuinely possible going forward. This is the deliverer being released instead of the ordinary prisoner, not ignorance of circumstance in any way, but a deliberate, conscious refusal to let circumstance alone have the very last word on the matter. This particular choice tends to feel, in the actual moment of making it, considerably riskier than the first, more automatic option. It doesn't carry the comfortable social cover of sounding sensible and grounded to anyone observing from outside. It requires a kind of quiet, internal defiance against exactly what the senses are currently insistently reporting, which is precisely why most people, most of the time, default back reflexively to the safer, more socially acceptable choice of releasing the ordinary prisoner instead, without much internal resistance to that default. An extended example: the verdict at the mailbox. Let me walk through a specific, fully developed scene now, because this entire teaching becomes considerably easier to recognize and actually use once it's applied to something concrete and genuinely ordinary, rather than left floating as distant biblical abstraction. Imagine someone checking their mail on an entirely ordinary afternoon and finding a rejection they'd genuinely been hoping wouldn't come, a declined application of some kind, an unfavorable decision on something they'd been quietly counting on for weeks. In the moment immediately after opening it, an internal trial takes place, fast and almost entirely unconscious, exactly the way Neville described this process happening within every person. The first, considerably more automatic response treats the rejection immediately as a comprehensive verdict, not merely about this one specific isolated situation, but about their broader worth as a person, their broader prospects going forward, their broader capability in general. The mind quickly, almost instantly assembles supporting evidence from memory, other past disappointments, other prior setbacks, an entire quiet, well rehearsed narrative about being someone for whom things generally, reliably don't work out well. Within minutes, without any deliberate, conscious decision ever actually being made along the way, the ordinary prisoner has already been released. Circumstance has been quietly granted final, comprehensive authority over the entire matter. The second, considerably less automatic response remains genuinely available in that exact same moment, though it requires actually noticing that a trial is taking place at all before it can be exercised. This alternative response acknowledges the rejection plainly and entirely honestly. Nothing whatsoever about it gets denied or minimized in the process. But rather than immediately, automatically assembling supporting evidence for some broader, sweeping verdict, this response deliberately pauses instead and asks directly, is this single piece of mail genuinely authorized to render judgment on my entire future, or am I about to hand it authority it was never actually entitled to in the first place? Simply out of habit, choosing to withhold that broader authority deliberately, choosing instead to hold a settled inner assumption that this one single rejection doesn't determine everything that comes next, is precisely the deliverer being released instead of the ordinary prisoner. The external event itself, in both versions of this story, is completely, entirely identical. The difference lies entirely and exclusively in which prisoner gets released in the minutes that immediately follow. And that specific difference, repeated daily across countless small moments exactly like this one, scattered throughout an ordinary life, is precisely what Neville was pointing toward as the actual ongoing mechanism shaping a person's entire life, considerably more than any single dramatic circumstance ever genuinely could on its own. Why the crowd almost always chooses wrong. It's genuinely worth asking honestly why most people, most of the time, default so reliably toward releasing the ordinary prisoner rather than the deliverer, because understanding the underlying pull toward this particular default makes it considerably easier to consciously resist going forward. Part of the answer involves simple, pervasive social conditioning absorbed over years without much conscious examination. Treating circumstance as the final governing authority is rewarded quietly and constantly as the recognizable mark of a mature, realistic, grounded adult who deals sensibly with the world. Someone who insists, even gently, that a difficult circumstance doesn't get the absolute final word can be met with genuine skepticism from others, even a kind of mild social discomfort, as though they're somehow refusing to accept reality as it plainly is. This creates a genuinely real incentive to default toward the safer, more socially validated choice, even in cases where doing so is quietly working against that person's own deeper, longer term interests. Part of the answer is also quite simply ordinary habit, built patiently through years and years of repeated practice without much conscious awareness. Every single time circumstance is granted final authority in some small moment, that particular pattern becomes slightly more automatic, slightly more likely to repeat itself reflexively the next time a similar moment happens to arise. By the time most people reach full adulthood, this particular habit has often been rehearsed many thousands of times already, making it feel considerably less like an active, ongoing choice and considerably more like a simple, unquestioned fact about how the world just happens to work. And part of the answer, genuinely worth naming honestly here rather than glossing over, is that choosing the deliverer instead requires tolerating real, genuine uncertainty in the meantime, at least for a while. Circumstance offers the immediate comfort of a clear, settled verdict, however unwelcome that verdict might happen to be. Refusing that verdict outright means sitting, at least temporarily, in a considerably less comfortable space where the ultimate outcome remains genuinely unsettled and open, which can feel noticeably less comfortable in the short term than simply accepting the circumstance's judgment outright and quickly moving on, even in cases where that judgment is actively working against the person's own genuine interests. The cost of choosing wrong, repeated daily, It's genuinely worth being honest here about what quietly accumulates over time when the ordinary prisoner gets released, day after day, in moment after small, unremarkable moment, without ever once being noticed, questioned, or examined closely. Each individual instance, taken entirely on its own, seems genuinely minor and inconsequential. One disappointing circumstance granted a bit more authority than it strictly, honestly deserved. One setback allowed to color the following week a bit more heavily than it reasonably should have. But these individual instances don't remain isolated from each other over time. They accumulate steadily into a settled, entrenched pattern, a habitual orientation towards circumstance as the ultimate governing authority in one's entire life. Over the course of months and years, this accumulated pattern gradually becomes something considerably closer to a fixed, stable identity, not because any single dramatic event ever determined it outright, but because thousands upon thousands of small daily verdicts, each one seemingly reasonable and defensible entirely on its own terms, gradually built steadily toward the exact same conclusion, repeated so often over time that it eventually stopped being questioned at all. This is precisely why Neville insisted, repeatedly and across many different lectures, that this particular trial needed to be understood clearly as a daily recurring event happening in real time, rather than as a single historical moment to be admired respectfully from a comfortable distance. The genuine stakes were never really about the distant past at all. They were always about noticing in real time right now which prisoner is about to be released in this particular present moment, because that specific release, repeated enough times across enough ordinary days, becomes quite literally the actual architecture of an entire life. Recognizing the trial as it happens. Because this particular choice happens quickly, almost instantaneously, and mostly beneath the level of conscious awareness, it genuinely helps to know the specific, recognizable signs that a trial is currently underway in real time, so it can be caught early and consciously redirected rather than being allowed to default automatically toward the familiar, well worn verdict. One clear sign is the sheer speed and automaticity with which a single piece of unwelcome information gets rapidly expanded into a considerably broader verdict about one's overall identity or entire future prospects. A single disappointing event rarely, if ever, stays contained as a single isolated event within the mind for very long. It tends instead to rapidly recruit supporting evidence from memory, assembling itself almost instantly into a considerably larger, more comprehensive case within mere moments. Noticing this rapid expansion happening in real time as it's actively occurring is often the clearest, most reliable signal that the trial is currently actively underway. Another clear sign is the particular felt quality of resignation that tends to follow closely on the heels of a difficult circumstance. A kind of quiet, almost paradoxically relieved, settling into the broader conclusion that this is simply permanently how things are and always will be. This particular quality of relief is genuinely worth noticing directly and honestly when it arises, because it often signals clearly that the ordinary prisoner has already quietly been released, and the genuine discomfort of remaining in honest uncertainty has already been quickly traded away for the false, premature comfort of a settled verdict. A third clear sign is the specific internal language used in the moments immediately following difficulty. Phrases like, "this always happens to me," or "of course it didn't work out, it never does," carry embedded quietly within their very structure an implicit granting of final, comprehensive authority to mere circumstance. Noticing this particular language as it arises internally, rather than simply accepting it uncritically as neutral description of fact, is often the single fastest way available to catch the trial actively in progress and consciously consider releasing a genuinely different verdict instead, before the old pattern fully completes itself, choosing differently, deliberately. Once the trial has been clearly recognized as it's actually happening in real time, the actual practical work of choosing differently is considerably simpler to describe than it is genuinely easy to execute consistently, though it does become noticeably more natural and more automatic with sustained repetition over time. The first step involves simply naming the trial honestly and directly, internally, the very moment it's first noticed occurring. This is a moment where I am about to grant mere circumstance final authority over something considerably larger than it actually genuinely deserves. This simple act of naming alone tends to create a small but genuinely useful pause in the automatic sequence, interrupting what would otherwise be an entirely automatic rush toward the familiar, well worn verdict. The second step involves asking directly within that small created pause, is this specific, particular circumstance actually entitled to render comprehensive judgment on my broader identity or my entire future? Or is it simply one isolated event, carrying only whatever authority I happen to be about to hand it voluntarily? This question genuinely doesn't require an elaborate, lengthy answer to be effective. It simply needs to be asked honestly and directly, which alone tends to noticeably loosen the automatic momentum that was building steadily toward the familiar default verdict. The third step involves deliberately choosing, in that same moment, to consciously withhold the broader, sweeping verdict, holding instead a settled inner assumption that this particular circumstance does not, in fact, determine everything that comes next in one's life. This doesn't require dramatic, forced conviction or artificial positivity layered awkwardly on top of genuine difficulty. It simply requires a quiet, steady refusal to let the ordinary prisoner walk free entirely unchallenged, releasing instead the deliverer, who genuinely represents your own authority over what remains possible, entirely regardless of whatever the current visible evidence happens to suggest in this particular moment, living with the verdict already chosen. There's one more piece worth adding here before closing, because recognizing the trial in a single moment is only the beginning of the practice, not its complete fulfillment on its own. Once the deliverer has genuinely been released in a given moment, the practice doesn't end there. The old verdict, the one favoring circumstance, will very likely attempt to reassert itself later that same day or the next morning, dressed up once again in the comfortable language of simple realism. This isn't evidence that the earlier choice was somehow wrong or ineffective. It's simply evidence that old patterns, rehearsed for years, don't dissolve permanently after a single conscious reversal. The practice, sustained over time, involves returning to the same choice repeatedly, each time the old verdict quietly resurfaces, without treating each return as evidence of failure. Each time you notice circumstance attempting to reclaim final authority, and each time you gently decline to grant it that authority again, the pattern favoring the deliverer grows slightly stronger, slightly more automatic, slightly more likely to be the default response the next time a difficult circumstance arrives unannounced. Closing. So, here is what I want to leave you with tonight. Somewhere in your day tomorrow, quite likely more than once, you'll be handed this exact same trial again, quietly and without any dramatic announcement preceding it. Something disappointing will happen, or some difficult fact will present itself unexpectedly, and in that precise moment, without necessarily noticing it consciously as a choice at all, you'll be asked which prisoner to release: the ordinary one, who offers only quiet confirmation of what already visibly exists in front of you, or the deliverer, who represents your own genuine standing authority over what remains possible despite whatever current appearances happen to suggest. Most days, most people release the ordinary prisoner without ever once noticing there was genuinely another option available to them the entire time. Tonight, and in the days ahead, try simply noticing the trial as it happens in real time, not fighting it forcefully, not straining to force a different outcome through sheer willpower, but pausing long enough each time to genuinely, honestly ask which authority you're about to grant final say over your life in this particular moment. The trial was never really ancient history, safely confined to a single afternoon 2,000 years distant from you. It's happening again tomorrow morning, the very moment the first difficult circumstance of the day presents itself to you. The only genuine question worth carrying forward from tonight is simply this: which prisoner are you going to release? This has been the Neville Archive. I'll see you in the next one.